Good morning. I'm Barbara Thompson, a member of Pastoral Care and Leadership Development Committee. And I'm leading this morning's service as worship associate. Welcome to our special place at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Quad Cities. We welcome all people into our beloved community of whatever age, race, class, ethnicity, physical ability, sexual orientation, gender identity, or religious background. We welcome especially those joining us here for the first time. We invite everyone to join us downstairs after service for coffee, snacks, and conversation. Thank you for joining us this morning.
You know, I must admit, when he paused, hear it? I thought, what a perfect ending. The train. So sorry, I blew through that. Good morning. I am Alice Martin, and I am here to do the reflections for the day and thank Barb for filling in all the pieces. This is the end of our theme for January. Today is the last day of stories. So I am going to open with a story. When the great Rabbi Israel ben al-Shem Tov saw misfortune threatening the Jews, it was his custom to go into a certain part of the forest to meditate. There he would light a fire, say a prayer, and the miracle would be accomplished and the misfortune would be averted. Years later, when a disciple of the rabbi had occasion of the same reason to intercede with heaven, he would go to the same place in the forest and say, Master of the universe, please listen. I do not know how to light the fire, but I am still able to say the prayer. And again, the miracle will be accomplished. Still later, another rabbi, in order to save his people once more, would go into that forest in the very same place and say, I don't know how to light the fire. I don't know the prayer, but I know this place, and that must be sufficient. It was sufficient, and the miracle was granted. Years passed, and it fell to one more rabbi to overcome misfortune. He was sitting in his home in his armchair, his head in his hands, and he spoke, I am unable to light a fire. I don't know the prayer, and I don't even know where this special place is in the forest. All I can do is tell the story, and that must be sufficient. And it was sufficient, and the miracle was granted. Sometimes when we have no words to express what we carry within us, words to articulate, we find we can only speak in stories as these rabbis did. We live stories from before we were born, and we create stories that survive long after we are gone. Today in our reflection, we will explore a thought from an author who states, stories have no beginning and no end, only doors through which one may enter. As told in our opening story, all we can do is tell our stories, and that must be sufficient. We will now light our chalice. As I read, Barb will light it for us. In the light of truth and in the warmth of love, we seek to sustain, and inspire. May we all rise in body or spirit for our opening song, Abide With Me, on page 101 or on the screen in front of us.
In the spirit of love and fellowship, we now greet the holy in our midst by briefly greeting those around us, especially those we do not know. Okay.
Thank you. All right. So I'm going to do words of all ages today. My name's Sarah Martin. I usually work in the nursery. We're going to do something different. We're going to do one of those stories where you jump around. So I'll tell some of the story, and then someone else will tell some of the story, and then someone else will add on to the story. And we're going to use this as our talking stick. So whoever is holding the stick gets to talk. So I'm going to start the story. Ready? So the theme is the never-ending story, right? So I once saw this movie, Once Upon a Time, where this kid was reading this book, and he was in the book. Have you read the story or heard it or watched the movie? No? All right. Well, so the kid's reading the story, and he's in this church, and he turns the pages, and it looks just like our church. And it's a Sunday morning, and it's snowing outside. Now it's your turn. Just add whatever you want. You can give it to adults, too. That's the other thing.
And he looks out the window and he sees a bird sitting in the tree, but it's a strange bird. He's never seen that bird before. It's got this strange color, which is
Now Stella wants it. It's a green bird. What else about it? It has two heads. Now we're going to Madeline.
And the bird eats bugs like its feathers.
Maybe that's where it gets the green. You want to, Elsie? Next person. Gracie. Dawn. Oh, Glennon wants it. Pass it to Glennon.
Then the bird comes down, swoops up the kid, and drops him right on top of the church.
Go.
And then the roof crashes and he's inside of it. Anybody?
Okay, 3 more people. He crashed in here, and then what happened?
And then the bird flew down, and then the bird said, "There's something waiting for you in the kitchen."
Oh, there's something in the kitchen. Who do you want to give it to next? Gracie? Okay, one more person.
Then the bug went on the kid's head and he like put his beak on his head.
Like a woodpecker kind of.
Yeah.
And then what happened? Dom? Sounds like Dom's got an idea. Okay, hand him the stick. He's going to be our last friend. Okay.
Then the bird brings him some pancakes or something. I don't know.
And then they have pancakes.
Yes.
The end.
We come together as a community to share the joys, the concerns, the sorrows, and the milestones of our lives. At this time of sharing, we take a moment to read your entries from the Book of Joys and Sorrows that's located on the table at the entrance of the sanctuary. We have a few today from Pastoral Care. Our good friend and longtime member, Marilyn Kester, has died. Her family was able to be with her when she passed. And from Mickey Kelly, whose adjectives are she, her, was informed by the Texas DHHS that I can't amend my birth certificate despite having a court order. Do we have anything online this morning for concerns?
Susan Perry thinks that Cindy Love is continuing to recover. And I know she is, I talked to her this morning.
Okay, we have some joys from Joe Majecko. Joe and Joanne will celebrate their 58th wedding anniversary on Tuesday. And from Andrea Gilman, who's running for Rock Island Milan School Board, advice is welcome. Lori McCullum, remembering our former member and amazing jazz pianist Margaret Skinner, who will be 100 tomorrow. And from Darcy Anderson, congrats and bravo for the letter to the editor from the Presbyterian Church of Davenport in support of our LGBTQ community members. Did we have any joys online? No? Okay. For what has been shared and for what remains in the quiet sanctuary of our hearts, we are grateful. And now let us become aware of the energy that brings us together here in beloved community as we share a time of silent meditation. May we open our hearts and minds to a place of quiet and engage in a silent prayer for the healing of pain and the balm of love. When the musical meditation begins, you are invited to come forward in silence and light a candle. This congregation is theologically diverse religious community with membership open to all who are in accord with our values, mission, and vision. Our congregation is entirely self-governed by the democratic process. One of the privileges of our free church tradition is to provide all of the financial support for our many ministries from among ourselves. Generosity, therefore, is one of the spiritual values we recognize as central to our personal and our institutional well-being. This month's undesignated plate offering will go to Quad Cities Interfaith. We invite you now to participate in the blessing of giving as the ushers come among you to accept the gifts of the congregation. Please be as generous as you are able. I love that. Thank you. For all the gifts of time and treasure that you give to this congregation, with sincere gratitude, we thank you.
So, as I mentioned in the opening, today is our last service on stories. And we've done it all month. And John DeGrieve told us how stories can connect us. Reverend Sabrina explored the question, is a story worth telling if it doesn't affect one? And Lori and a host of other voices shared the story of the civil rights movement. I'd like to suggest that today's reflection will be inclusive of all of their thoughts, all of their stories, as we explore the never-ending nature of stories. The rabbi in our opening left us with that thought that all we can do is tell our story and it will be sufficient. Today we will explore as well what that means in the telling of our stories and how we have that potential to change us. For as someone once said, a story is a trick for sneaking a message into the fortified citadel of the human mind. The following story demonstrates that. So there was a village remotely removed from most other communities. I'm on the wrong page. Wrong story. There was once a man who wandered into a strange land. The inhabitants of this land welcomed him joyfully, and he became one with them. But the one thing they told this stranger was he must never enter the field that was inhabited by monsters. And when they said that, there was fear sparking from their eyes. But the stranger was curious, so one day he wandered into the field to see these monsters, and he was surprised to find that they were watermelons. Well, these people are nuts. They're watermelons. I'll show them that. So he cut a watermelon from the vine, took it into the village, called them all together, and he started to eat the watermelon, as if to show them they were not monsters. The people were terrified. They thought the stranger was a bigger monster than the very ones that were out in the field, and he fled for his life, never to be seen again. Years later, another man wandered into the strange land, and they welcomed him as well, but they again said, "Do not go into that field because there's monsters." Being curious, he wandered off one day and was surprised to see that they were watermelons. So he came back empty-handed. He called the people together, and night after night, he would tell stories of the watermelon and what it had meant for him. He recalled spitting the seeds and seeing who could spit the farthest. His brothers would even spit seeds and see how many could stick to each other's faces. People rolled the watermelons down the hills. They're smashing in various places, and it's really fun to smash them when you throw them into the ground. Over time, the people began to laugh at his stories, and one day they found the courage to go out, brought back one watermelon, and placed it in the town square. It stayed there for several days, people curiously walking around it, waiting for it to consume them, but it never happened. And the man, content with his mission, said goodbye, and the people grew watermelons and now export them to America, and we're probably eating them even as we speak. There's the power of stories. The stories the man shared struck a message into the citadel of our minds that oftentimes is closed. It changes us. Stories work like that. They drop us a hint of something new, and they change a perspective, or they ignite our imagination with a never-before thought. The need to tell these stories has been around since the beginning of humankind. At elders, we've often pictured sharing orally the stories of their ancestors. We know that the pictographs on caves are beginnings of the stories. We now have libraries, my gosh, with thousands and thousands and millions of stories. And then we have TVs and movies and documentaries. And we even have coffee shops now filled with people telling stories. These stories told are never ending, for they carry themes that spark within us, the human heart. Themes of personal growth, inspiration, connection, and remembrances of the past. In hearing these stories, something slips in, and we get to imagine how we might live our lives. I'd like to share a few of those stories that have been impactful for me. The first is about imagination, the power of a story that creates endless possibilities and meaning before the ordinary. So, have you ever wondered about things and could find no answers? I've often wondered, imagine this, how our ancestors of the past figured out how fire could be contained and used for its heat. All they knew that was a fire burned down their forest from a lightning bolt from a god sent down to curse them. So I actually went on the internet at various times and seeing if anybody actually knew what that leap might have been, and there was nothing. So here's my story of how this might have begun, where humans learned to contain and use fire. Picture it, as a Golden Gal would say. Oh, it's on another page. Look at this, I got so many papers. Here it is. Okay, eons ago, before humans learned to harness fire, imagine, if you will, a small village. People gathered at night in the frosty air for their main meal, and they're eating raw meat, and their condiment is basically the maggots that have infested the meal. They would tell the stories of their hunting expeditions with pauses to wipe the maggots off of their beards and their long hair. They were cold, but frightened of the fires from the lightning strikes that consumed their forests, so they kept eating raw meat with the maggots and shivering to keep warm. As the story goes, one day, a small boy wandered from the village, his intent to play in the tar pit that was not far from his village. When he came to the tar pit, he always would grab a stick and he'd stir it and watch it swirl in the tar pit. He suddenly heard voices coming and he knew his mom and dad were coming to drag him away from the tar pit. So he jumped up with his stick covered in tar and began to run, but he tripped and fell into a pile of leaves. His father caught him and yanked him up by the hair, grabbed the stick and shook the boy. Just then, a man approached them who was so angry that his wife had eaten the last of the bison liver. So angry that he walked striking 2 rocks together, sending sparks flying from those rocks. At that exact moment, the angry man struck the rocks, sending sparks to the leaves that stuck on the stick by tar, and it caught fire. They were horrified. They threw the stick down, stamped up the fire, and ran back to the village. Now, for the next months, the villagers kept eating their raw meat and shivering, but as they did so, there was a story that was always told about the rocks and the tar leaves, or the leaves and the tar. Many would say, oh, that's God's blessing on us because we're good people. God will take care of us. Some thought it was a conspiracy theory made up just to tell a story. Others thought it might be those bugs, that fly around with lights that flick. Maybe they got stuck on the tar. Then one day, as the story had been repeated over and over again, someone said, imagine if the rocks, as they were struck together, threw off a spark of fire. Oh, it lit up another's imagination. What if that spark of fire lit the leaves on fire, like they does in the forest? And then another imagined, maybe that tar doesn't really burn, but it contains fire. Oh, they were so excited. With the shriek of excitement, they all ran back to the tar pit. They all took sticks and stuck leaves on them and spent hours and days until the spark of fire caught on and they knew they had created a new possibility. Now, this story is never ending, and we revisit every time we light our grills or fire pits, or we turn on the burners of our ovens, or gather around a fire to tell stories. Now, I would like to add that although they were now able to sit around fire to stay warm, they still were eating raw meat dripping with maggots, for that was yet to be imagined. And that's a story for another day. The imagining of possibilities, opening up new thoughts that connect from one to another, and before you know it, we land a human being on the moon. Never ending, as every time I light a fire in my fireplace, I see dancing in the flames the storytellers of old. I live in the present, living my new stories, and through those flickering flames, I hear all the stories yet to be told, and that is sufficient. So, imagination, the portal and the citadels of our minds that opens up new things. I would also share a story about being changed, transformation, growth. It is a story that occurred for me as I was a chaplain in the hospital, and I'd like to share it with you. I was in the hospital, and I was on call at Genesis in Davenport. I received a call one night asking me to go to the emergency room as a young man had brought in his infant daughter who had just passed away, and the staff considered it might be shaken baby syndrome. Would I come and sit with him until the police arrived? When I arrived, I was escorted into a small room where the man was being held. He was sobbing. Curled up in a fetal position, the only available seat on the sofa was next to him. I sat there next to him, and he gradually noticed my presence, but he remained in his fetal position as his sobbing began to quiet. As we sat in silence, he began wrenchingly, in between sobs. His father had beaten him as a child, something the young man had promised he would never, ever do to his children. And yet he had. He had walked up and down the room with his daughter. Nothing he had done would quiet her, and the insistent screaming brought him to the end of his rope, and he shook her, yelling at her he couldn't do it anymore and to shut up. He then unfolded himself from his fetal position. With nothing left to say, I opened my arms, and he leaned into them, and he sobbed into my shoulder. We stayed that way, and it wasn't much longer before the police came and took him away. That night, from that story, opened up a portal in me of empathy and judgment, and it sparked expansion and a deepening of empathy. It was not up to me to judge another his actions, no matter how horrific the outcome, but to simply be present to the humanity that lie deep within him in the now and what is as another human being to another human being, just doing the best we can. Given different circumstances of my upbringing, I too could have been him. I also had a breakthrough to me for a second note that I need not search for the right words. I don't have to be that master of wisdom that's going to turn around a person's life or take away their pain. His daughter had died, the police were coming, and he very well could spend the rest of his life in prison. The greatest thing I gave him was just my presence, bearing witness to his shame, his remorse, his anguish, and yet acknowledging him that I'm there with him in it. And it was sufficient, and it was enough. That man's story to me did not end that night, but it became never-ending. For when I walked the halls of a hospital or with hospice patients, I had learned from this man to go in with an open heart, an ever-ready presence to bear witness to their lives, and I sat with them in that way. This story he shared is never-ending for all the people who are touched by us as we listen to them, we care about them, and we do not judge them, is a continuation of this man's story with that gift he gave to me and I have given to others. And let that keep being our story. And at last, at least for this reflection at this time, the power of humor in stories. So, stories take you on a journey around the world and throughout the whole places of your heart. So, sometimes when I really get bedraggled and tied up with the struggles of life, and some of those days you're just hanging your head and trying to get through the day, carrying too much that really isn't mine to carry, hanging on when I need to let go, upset with things I can't change. I find relief in watching people unsuspectedly being human. One of my favorite is funniest home videos. For tripping down the stairs, to knocking over your mother's pride vase, to wearing your pants backwards, these all make me laugh. I identify with the intricacies of our human living, and we share them far more than what we might think. So I'm going to share my favorite joke. This is the only one I remember, but I still laugh when I remember it. So it is a story of a pope in the Catholic Church. The pope dies, and he naturally goes to heaven. He's met by the reception committee, there is one I hear, and after a whirlwind tour, he is told that he can enjoy any of the many places of recreation there is in heaven. He decides that he wants to read all of the ancient original text of the Holy Scriptures. So he spends the next eon learning their languages. He becomes a linguistic master. That's possible in heaven. He sits down in the library and he begins to pore over every version of the Bible, working back from the most recent easy reading to the original scripts. And all of a sudden, there's a scream in the library. The angels come running in only to find the Pope, who is now huddled in his chair, crying to himself and muttering, an R, an R. They left out an R. A particular, very concerned angel takes him aside and he offers comfort and asks what the problem is and what does that mean? After collecting himself, the Pope sobs again. It's the letter R. They left out the R. The word was supposed to be celebrate. I'm not a good speller, so I had to look that up, but celibate does not have an R. That is the power of stories. They take us to tears, they take us to laughter, and everything in between. And it's a journey. The stories remind us of our highest ideals as well as our common experiences. In a world that's too often so painful and distracting and divided, that power can give us unending wonder, healing, understanding, inspiration, and humor. Stories unlock our imaginations to see beyond these obstacles and strive toward the new, the beautiful, those things yet unseen. Let us open our minds and hearts in the coming weeks and see what message gets through to us, to understand, to harness the power of story into our lives and those around us. And as the rabbi said, it will be sufficient. I got so many papers I can't find the main script. What's up? And now please rise in body or spirit for our closing song. 1074 in the gray hymnal, Turn the World Around. I didn't say that. See? Humor. There we go. You may be seated. Please join us in the extinguishing of the flame. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of the community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
We have a few announcements today. If you have an announcement for a Sunday service, please send it to office@uucqc.org by noon on Thursday before the service. UU Valley Values and You begins next Sunday, February 2nd, before the service from 9 to 9:45 a.m. The newly created Adult Religious Ed team welcomes all to an 8-week exploration of the UU's adoption of 6 shared values centered around love as a guiding expression of our faith. We will be focused on one value each Sunday, starting on Sunday, February 2nd from 9 to 9:45. The first value we will explore is transformation. Childcare will be provided and Zoom will be available upon request. At General Assembly this past June, the Unitarian Universalist Association passed an action for immediate witness in support of Palestine and a call to educate ourselves about the Israel-Palestine conflict. With that in mind, the Board of Trustees and the Social Justice Committee ask you to please save the date for a film event, which will happen here on the afternoon of March 8th. The film is The Occupation of the American Mind, narrated by Roger Waters of Pink Floyd fame. Journalist David Zirin of The Nation magazine calls it a vital and unmissable film. We encourage you not to miss it. One Human Family is offering a nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience training at the Metropolitan Community Church on Wednesday, February 12th at 7 p.m. Whether or not you have ever participated in resistance or ever intend to, the training offers a better understanding of what one seeks to accomplish and, more importantly, the manner in which one respectfully protests and resists. For more information, contact Lori McCullum. Would you stand up for just a minute, Lori? Thank you. The RE team is asking for donations of soups and desserts for the Valentine's Day Dance fundraiser for Youth RE. It would be good if there were some vegetarian and gluten-free options. Please help us label things and mark any common allergens. Food drop-off for the Valentine's Day Dance will be 3 to 4 p.m. on Saturday, February 8th. We are also happy to have help at the dance. We would be happy to have help at the dance that evening. Please contact Tiffany Kaldenbach, who you can also reach at re@uucqc.org. Oh, not quite done, sorry. Finally, let me draw your attention to the additional announcements printed on the back of your order of service. Thanks, Brian.
And now for our closing, we have one final story. There was a church long ago that was holding their Sunday service. The member who played the piano was not able to come at the last minute, so an older member volunteered to play that morning. All went well until the pastor was about to end his sermon. What was begun to be heard was a quiet snoring from the piano player, still seated in front of the piano. Do you identify with that, Gates? The pastor, now at the end of the sermon, spoke loudly while slamming his hand on the podium and cried out to the congregation, "This here ends my reflection, and may all the congregation say amen." And they did. They screamed it back, which woke the gentleman on the piano bench. Without missing a beat, he shook himself awake and started to play the final hymn. This story, with a bit of embellishment on my part, is a story that occurred in 1871 in the congregation's new chapel on Perry and 9th Street. That congregation was ours. And I found this story in a book Betty Gorshey wrote, which is Anne Harrington's mother and Diane and Hannah's grandmother. She recorded so many such events in this book that she published in 1993. I'm going to pause for a minute and do something I had thought about, but I'm going to do it. And I came upon such a story yesterday, and so I actually marked it, those sticky notes. In it, I found a very brief paragraph written by Anne. And it's a story. And then I will share it. I don't know how old Anne was. It was in the 60s. There is no date. Anne wrote, I remember as a young girl sitting in the sanctuary, looking toward Eastern Avenue, watching the cows graze in the pasture. Listening to my Sunday school teacher, Marilyn Kester, read stories, and in parentheses, she was the best storyteller. Trick-or-treating for UNICEF and gathering at the church afterward for a festive party. Molly Teagland, as the witch, was at the Halloween functions. We made gingerbread costumes for the Hansel and Gretel production, and on she went with a few other memories. But these stories are still with us today, carried in those who have gone before us, as Marilyn Kester, a storyteller. We still tell stories. Thank you, Marilyn. Or Molly, foregoing her ego and dressing up as a witch. Anne ends with this comment. These stories are etched in my mind to pass on to my children as part of my Unitarian childhood. There is the never-ending stories. We have them here. We're still here. 147 years ago, it was a small church on 9th and Gaines, and here we are. This story that we are living will have an impact on the next generation and the next and the next, maybe for another 150 years. These stories help us remember who we are and what we believe. They strike our imaginations with new wonder and possibilities. They deepen us to listen and build our beloved community. And it is sufficient. And one day, I hope, we will all be telling the same story throughout the world. Simply different characters and settings. And peace will be ours. And finally, the lion and the lamb will lay down together in peace. May this be so. And she said, Amen. Now may the road rise up to meet you. May the wind be always at your back. May the sun shine warm upon your face, the rains fall soft upon your fields, and until we meet again, may stories accompany you on your journey. Amen.